The last time anyone saw Seraphine Vale alive, she was standing in the snow, barefoot, still wearing the white gown she had put on that morning with trembling hands and a heart full of hope, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her silver eyes, those strange, luminous eyes that had always unnerved the court, fixed on nothing at all. Just standing there at the edge of the Ashwood forest, perfectly still, while the sounds of celebration drifted from the great hall behind her. Music, the laughter, the clink of goblets raised in a toast to the Alpha King and his chosen queen, a queen who was not her. The sentry who spotted her said she looked like a painting, too still, too pale, too perfectly composed to be real. He almost didn't call out to her. He almost let her be. But he did call out. He said her name, once, into the dark, and by the time he blinked, she was gone. No tracks in the snow, no scent trail, no sound of running. Just the impression of 2 small feet in the white, and then nothing, as if the forest had simply opened its mouth and swallowed her whole. 3 days later, when the Alpha King was finally told, his goblet shattered in his fist, not because he was angry, because he understood, in that instant of shattering crystal and wine spreading like blood across the marble floor, exactly what he had done, and exactly what he had lost. This is the story of what happened after. Of what a king does when he has broken the one thing he was always destined to protect, of the price of pride, of the weight of a crown that suddenly feels like a collar, and of a woman, quiet, unseen, underestimated, who turned out to be the foundation everything else was built upon. This is the story of Seraphine Vale, and of the Alpha King who destroyed her, and then spent every waking hour trying to find the pieces. The kingdom of Ashvale sat between 2 mountain ranges like something the earth had exhaled and forgotten to take back, vast and wild and achingly beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. To the east, the Iron Peaks scraped the sky, their slopes home to the warrior clans who had bled for Ashvale for generations. To the west, the Thornmere wetlands stretched for miles, ruled by smaller, older packs who remembered a time before the Alpha King and kept that memory like a wound. And at the center of it all, pressed between dark forest and silver river, stood Thornhaven, the royal seat, carved from black stone and older than the name it carried. The Alpha King was Calian Draven, 29 years old, 7 feet of leashed, barely contained power. Dark hair, always slightly too long, eyes the color of storm clouds just before they break open. He had taken the crown at 22 after his father's death, not in grief, but in battle, fighting off 3 rival alphas who saw a young king and smelled opportunity. He had killed all 3 before the month was out. The 4th had bent the knee. Calian ruled the way wolves run, at the front, setting the pace, tolerating no weakness in himself. He was respected. He was feared. He was in the complicated calculus of a werewolf kingdom, loved. What he was not, though no one was brave enough to say it, was wise. Not about everything, not about her. And Seraphine Vale had come to Thornhaven 7 years before the night she disappeared. She had come not as a dignitary, not as a ward, but as a servant, the daughter of a disgraced pack soldier who had given his life to Calian's father, and left behind nothing but a daughter with unusual eyes and an unusual gift. She could calm wolves with her presence alone, not through dominance or fear, but through something quieter and harder to name. Something the old pack healers called the silver thread, a rare ancient trait that hadn't been seen in Ashvale in 3 generations. She had been 17 when she arrived, 17 and utterly invisible, for a time. Calian had noticed her the way you notice a sound you can't quite identify. At the edge of perception, present but unnamed. She was always in the background, arranging documents his council left in disarray, calming the warhounds when they snarled at visiting ambassadors. Sitting in the back of the great hall during formal feasts, not eating, just watching, as if she were taking quiet inventory of everything around her. He had spoken to her first by accident, or what he told himself was accident. He had been in the training yard at midnight, working through a rage he couldn't name, and she had simply been there, sitting on the low stone wall with a book open in her lap, reading by moonlight. He had snapped at her, told her the yard was closed. She had looked up with those silver eyes and said very calmly, "You're going to break your wrist if you keep hitting the post with your offhand. You've been favoring it since last Tuesday." He had stared at her. She had looked back down at her book. That was how it started. Over the years that followed, something grew between them that neither of them had names for. He sought her out, not always openly, not in ways the court would see and speak of, but consistently, as with the quiet persistence of water finding the lowest point. She was the person he told things to, small things sometimes, large things occasionally. The death of a soldier he had trained since childhood, the treaty negotiation that made him feel like a traitor to his own people, the nightmares he never admitted to anyone else. She listened. She never flinched. She never offered hollow comfort or political counsel dressed as sympathy. She simply listened, and sometimes she offered a precise observation that cut through the noise the way a knife cuts through rope, clean, quick, and leaving you wondering why it took so long. He told himself it was nothing, that she was useful, that the connection was purely functional, the silver thread, a healer's trait, nothing more. The wolves who watched him more closely than he watched himself knew better. But the court was a place of performance and strategy, and what the Alpha King chose not to name remained officially unnamed. Well, until the year he turned 28, until the bonding council convened and the noble families began presenting their daughters, and the pressure for an alliance match reached a fever pitch that even Kalian could no longer withstand, until he made the worst decision of his life. The choosing ceremony for the Alpha King of Ashvale was not merely a wedding. It was a political declaration, a spiritual rite, and, to those who still believed in the old ways, a sealing of fate. It was conducted on the winter solstice, under the full moon, in the great courtyard of Thornhaven, before every noble house, every pack elder, and every warrior clan in the kingdom. The woman chosen would not merely be queen. She would be the Alpha's bonded mate in the pack sense, their souls and wolves tied together in a bond that, once made, could not be unmade without destroying one or both of them. It was not a decision made lightly. Kilian, as it turned out, made it recklessly. Her name was Isolde Vane, second daughter of the Vane pack who controlled the Iron Peaks and had been angling for closer ties to the throne for a generation. She was beautiful in the way of mountain storms, sharp-edged and dramatic, with copper hair and pale green eyes and a smile that showed all of her teeth. She was politically useful. She was strategically perfect. She was not Seraphine. Kilian had told himself in the weeks leading to the ceremony that it didn't matter. That what he felt for Seraphine was a complicated fondness, not destiny, that the kingdom needed an alliance, not a sentiment, that a servant girl, however gifted, however present in his mind at all hours of the night, could not be the Alpha Queen of Ashvale. The nobles would never accept it. The warrior clans would read it as weakness. His hold on the kingdom was strong, but not unbreakable. He told himself all of this. He told himself very firmly and very often. He almost believed it. Seraphine had heard about the ceremony from the household steward 3 weeks before it happened. She had stood in the corridor outside the council chamber and listened to Lord Marin Vane's voice drifting through the heavy oak doors, and she had understood, in the clinical clear-eyed way, she understood most things, exactly what was coming. She had also understood, with a grief that settled into her chest like cold water, what it meant. She did not cry. She did not confront Kalian. She did not seek him out in the training yard at midnight or slip a note under his chamber door or do any of the things that a woman in a story might do when she realizes the person she loves is about to choose someone else. She did something far more dangerous. She stayed. She stayed because Kalian had not asked her to go, because no one had told her she wasn't welcome, because a small, A stubborn part of her, the part that had survived her father's disgrace and her own years of invisibility and a dozen quiet heartbreaks before this one, refused to disappear before she was made to. She told herself she would watch the ceremony and feel nothing. She told herself she had known this day was coming. She told herself she was strong enough. The night of the solstice was bitterly cold. The courtyard blazed with 1,000 torches and silver-threaded banners in the Draven colors, black and ash and deep river blue. Every noble house of Ashvale stood in their finery. Warriors lined the stone walls, their breath clouding in the frost. The full moon sat directly above the courtyard, enormous and white, flooding everything in cold silver light. Seraphine stood at the very back of the assembled crowd. She had not dressed for the occasion. She wore her usual dark wool gown, practical and plain, and she had braided her hair simply. She looked, if you were not paying close attention, like someone who had wandered in by mistake. Kalian entered from the great hall doors, and the crowd parted like water around stone. He was magnificent. She hated herself for thinking it, but it was simply true. He wore Ashvale's formal ceremonial armor, black plate with silver detailing, his wolf crest at the center of his chest, and the crown of the Alpha King, in hammered iron set with a single obsidian stone, dark and absolute, on his brow. He moved with the kind of certainty that came not from arrogance, but from being, genuinely, the most powerful person in any room he entered. He did not look for her. She had told herself she didn't want him to. The ceremony unfolded the way ceremonies do, with ritual words and the elder's blessing and the presentation of the chosen. Isolde Vane stepped forward, looking every inch the queen she had spent her life preparing to be, and the crowd responded with the appropriate displays of admiration and approval, and the Vane contingent cheered loud enough to drown out everything else. And then Kalian spoke the words of choosing. The formal declaration, the binding promise. His voice was steady and clear and absolutely devoid of hesitation. Seraphine felt each word land like a stone dropped into still water, felt the ripples spread, felt the cold that had nothing to do with winter move through her chest. She didn't move. She kept her face very still and her hands loose at her sides and her silver eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she breathed slowly through the thing that was happening inside her. It was only when the ceremony concluded, when the elder bound Kalian and Isolde's hands with the silver cord and the crowd erupted and the celebration began, that Seraphine understood she couldn't stay, not through the feast, not through the music, not through a single moment more of standing in the back of this beautiful, terrible room and being invisible while the man she had quietly, devastatingly loved for 7 years danced with someone else. She left. Quietly, the way she did everything, slipping through the crowd like water through rock. No one noticed. No one ever noticed her when she didn't want to be seen. She went to her small room in the servants' quarters and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, and then she stood up. And she packed. Not everything. She didn't have much, and she didn't take most of what she had. She took what mattered, her mother's leather-bound herbal, her father's compass, a change of clothes, and a small cloth pouch of coin she had saved over 7 years of careful, patient saving. She dressed warmly, she plaited her hair back, and she walked out of Thornhaven, through the servants' corridor, through the kitchen yard, through the gate that was left unlatched on feast nights. She moved without hurry, without dramatics, with the eerie calm of someone who has already made their peace. She crossed the outer courtyard. She passed the sentry who would later remember her, who almost didn't call out, who called out anyway. She stopped just for a moment, at the edge of the ashwood. She looked back at Thornhaven, at the blazing light of the great hall windows, at the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, at the distant sound of celebration carried on the frost. She turned around, and she walked into the dark. The news of Seraphine's disappearance did not reach Kalian immediately. It moved through the household the way bad news often does in royal courts, in whispers and sideways glances, in carefully worded questions and deliberate silences. The household steward knew first, then the head housekeeper, then two of the senior pack advisors. They debated, as they always did, whether the Alpha King needed to be told. He was newly bonded. It was a celebration. Seraphine Vale was a servant with a minor gift and no political significance. They waited 3 days. On the third morning, it was Lord Aldrich Voss, the head of pack security, a scarred, gray-haired man who had served Calian's father and had always watched Seraphine with the attentiveness of someone who suspected she was more than she appeared, who walked into the Alpha's private study and told him the truth. She was gone, had been gone since the night of the ceremony. No one knew where, no note, no message. The Ashwood sentry had seen her at the forest's edge, and then she had simply ceased to be. The goblet shattered. For a long moment, Calian simply stood there in the wreckage of crystal and wine, and Lord Aldrich watched him with the careful, measuring attention of a man who had seen kings break before and always noted the shape of the fracture. "How long has she been gone?" Calian's voice was entirely level. That was, Aldrich knew, the danger sign. 3 days, my king." Another silence, very long. "Why wasn't I told?" Aldrich chose honesty over diplomacy. The council believed it to be a servant's choice, that she had left voluntarily, that pursuing the matter would be politically complicated given "get out," still perfectly level, and then send me Marin. Marin was Calian's head tracker, the best in the kingdom, a lean, dark-eyed woman who had been finding things that didn't want to be found for 20 years. She arrived within the hour. Calian told her what he knew, which was almost nothing. "I need you to find her," he said. Marin looked at him for a moment. "The Ashwood is old, my king. If someone enters it and doesn't want to be tracked, I don't care what the Ashwood is. I need you to find her." Marin left without another word. In the days that followed, the court buzzed with a dozen different theories. The most popular was that Seraphine had fled in jealousy or shame, that the servant girl who had grown too close to the Alpha King had taken the choosing ceremony as her dismissal and run. Some said it was just as well. The new queen, Isolde Vane, said nothing publicly, but those who watched her closely noticed that she never asked after Seraphine. Not once. A smaller, older, more careful subset of the court said very little. They watched Calian's face during meetings and noted the particular quality of his distraction. They watched him stop mid-sentence in council chambers and look toward the window with an expression no one could quite name. They watched the muscle in his jaw when Seraphine's name was mentioned, which happened less and less as the weeks passed because the court was adept at reading what the Alpha King did not wish to hear. But none of them knew what Calian had discovered the night after the goblet shattered. None of them knew what he had found in the pack archive, in the old records that the elder had pressed into his hands the morning of his bonding ceremony, with a look that he hadn't understood until now. He had read it at 3 a.m, alone in his study with a dying fire, and everything had rearranged itself. The pack archive of Ashvale was older than Thornhaven itself, older than the Draven line. It lived in a vault beneath the Great Hall, kept by a succession of pack elders who were as much librarians as they were spiritual leaders. The records it contained were not merely historical, some of them were prophetic. The accumulated observations of generations of seers and healers and wolf speakers who had watched the patterns of fate move through their bloodlines like currents in deep water. And Calian had always dismissed the prophetic records as the mystical excess of an earlier age. He was a warrior king. He believed in strength and strategy and the clear, legible logic of power. He had stopped believing that at 3 a.m, 3 days after the choosing ceremony, reading a document in his dead father's handwriting, The document was a lineage record. Specifically, it was the lineage record of the Vale family, Seraphine's family, and his father had annotated it in the margins with the careful precision of a man who had known what it meant and chosen to say nothing. The silver thread was not merely a healer's gift, it was a mate marker. The old lore. The lore so old that even the elders didn't speak of it openly, described the silver thread as the external manifestation of a true mate bond in its dormant state. It appeared in certain wolves whose mate was powerful enough to require a guide, not just any guide, a soul-level counterweight, someone whose energy was, quite literally, the balancing opposite of their mates, someone whose presence created a stability in the paired wolf that nothing and no one else could replicate, a true alpha's mate. The records were explicit. The silver thread had appeared in every documented case, and in the mate of a wolf destined for the highest level of alpha power, the kind that hadn't manifested in Ashvale in 3 generations, the kind that was not merely dominance or strength, but something older, something the old tongue called Vialthir, the sovereign soul. The alpha whose bond with their mate was not just a pairing, but an anchoring of the entire pack's spiritual health. And in every documented case, the true alpha who failed to bond with their silver-threaded mate had experienced the same progression. First, instability, then escalating power without control. Then, the slow dissolution of the pack bonds around them, their warriors becoming unreliable, their alliances fracturing, their wolf straining against its own containment. And without exception, the true alpha who lost their silver-threaded mate before the bond was sealed had, within 5 years, watched their kingdom fracture. Kilian read it 3 times, then a 4th. Then he set the document down very carefully on his desk and sat very still in the dying light of the fire for a long time. He had chosen Isolde Vane for political stability. He had, in doing so, walked away from the only thing capable of actually creating it. He had stood in that courtyard and spoken words of choosing with Seraphine 20 feet away in the back of the crowd, and he hadn't known. He had told himself what he felt wasn't what it was, and she had been standing there in a dark wool gown with her hair braided simply, and he hadn't said her name even once. And now, she was gone. The fire went out. Kalian sat in the dark for a long time. And when he finally stood up, the expression on his face was one that Lord Aldrich Voss, watching from the doorway because he was a careful man and he had learned to watch, had never seen on the Alpha King before. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was purpose, absolute, unrelenting, kingdom-burning purpose. "Find her," Kalian said without turning around. "All units, every tracker, every scout. I want every territory searched and I want answers on my desk within 72 hours. Aldrich was already moving. The mobilization of Ashvale's search forces was the largest military deployment the kingdom had seen since the border wars 6 years prior, and it was, in many ways, more frightening. Because the border wars had had a visible enemy, a direction, a logic. What Kalian launched in the weeks following Seraphine's disappearance had none of those things. It was pure desperation wearing the armor of command. 60 trackers deployed across 8 territories. Scouts sent into the Thornmere wetlands, where the old packs watched with narrowed eyes and said nothing helpful. Warriors dispatched to the Iron Peaks, Vane territory, which created its own complications. Since the Vane family took the presence of Ashvale warriors on their land as an implicit insult, and said so loudly in the form of a formal protest delivered to Kilian's council by a cold-eyed Vane steward who had clearly rehearsed his speech, Isolde, the new queen, summoned Kalian to her chambers and asked him, with the careful control of a woman who had been raised to manage her reactions, who Seraphine Vale was. "A member of my household," Kalian said. 60 trackers for a member of your household. She is missing. I find everyone who goes missing in my kingdom." The silence between them was long and brittle and sharp at the edges. "My father is concerned," Isolde said finally. "Your father should focus on the Iron Peaks," Kalian said. And he left. The vain alliance, the entire political rationale for the choosing ceremony, began to fray at the edges within a month. Lord Marin Vane wrote 3 increasingly terse letters, each one a degree more pointed than the last. The third one stopped just short of a threat. Caelian read it and set it aside and asked his tracker for a new report. The reports were maddening: sightings that dissolved on approach, rumors that pointed in 3 directions simultaneously. A healer in the eastern settlements who had treated a dark-haired woman with silver eyes 3 weeks after the ceremony, but the woman had moved on before anyone could verify. A ferryman on the Thornmere border who remembered a young woman crossing alone, paying with coin, saying nothing about where she was headed. A child in the forest village of Grey Hollow who told the scouts about the quiet lady who had slept in the barn for 2 nights before walking south at dawn. South. She was moving south, away from Ashvale, away from the kingdom, away from everything. The discovery of each false lead cracked something open in Caelian that he was not accustomed to managing. He was a wolf who had always moved toward problems with absolute certainty. He was not built for the particular agony of searching for something that did not wish to be found by the hands that lost it. His warriors saw it. His council saw it. Even the warhounds, who were sensitive to mood in the pack-intuitive way of their kind, had become restless and strange, pacing their kennels at night and lifting their heads to howl at nothing. The pack bonds were already shifting. Elder Cora, the oldest surviving pack elder, a tiny, terrifying woman who had been alive longer than anyone in Thornhaven could accurately calculate, came to Caelian's study without being summoned and sat herself down across from his desk and looked at him with the patient, pitiless clarity of deep water. "You've read the archive," she said. It was not a question. "Yes? Then you know what's happening. Tell me anyway." Cora folded her hands in her lap. The Vaelthir bond doesn't simply cease because the alpha ignores it. It continues, and when the silver-threaded mate is separated from the true alpha, especially after the formal choosing of another, the bond becomes a wound, not merely for the 2 individuals involved, for the pack. She paused. "Your warriors are having difficulty holding their forms. The youngest packmates are showing elevated aggression. 3 of your northern scouts failed to complete their shift last week and couldn't account for the time. Caelian had received those reports. He hadn't told anyone else what he suspected was causing it. "How long?" he asked. "Before the pack bonds deteriorate to crisis level. If she is not found and the bond not addressed?" Cora met his eyes. 8 months. Perhaps less. The silence in the room was enormous. "And the bond with Isolde?" "Is not a true bond. It has none of the anchor qualities the Vaelthir requires. It is a political arrangement in spiritual clothing." Cora said this without judgment, which somehow made it worse. "It will not hold the pack." Caelian stood up from his desk and went to the window. Outside, the winter was still holding, the sky the color of iron, the training yard below empty and gray. "She didn't know," he said very quietly. "She didn't know what she was to me, what the bond was. No one told her." "No," Cora agreed. "No one told her. She simply felt it. As silver-threaded mates always do. They feel the pull and they wait. And if the alpha chooses another—" She paused delicately. "They understand that they are not wanted. And they go." The words landed the way truths do when they are terrible, not with a crash, but with a quiet, irreversible settling. "Find her," Cora said, standing. "Find her and tell her the truth. All of it. What she is, what she carries, what you failed to see." She moved toward the door and then paused. "And when you find her, Alpha King, do not make the mistake of believing that what you owe her is merely an explanation. You owe her a choice. A real one. Not the one she was never given." She left. Caelian stood at the window for a long time. Then he called for his horse. He was going south himself. The Kalian rode with a small company, Lord Aldrich, Marin the Tracker, and 4 hand-selected warriors who were sworn to silence on the matter. No banners, no royal insignia. 6 wolves on the road south, moving fast and quiet through the gray winter landscape, and as they moved, they began to collect the things Seraphine had left in her wake. Not intentionally, she was far too careful for that, but the silver thread left traces that Marin, once she knew what she was looking for, could follow in ways that had nothing to do with footprints. Animals were calmer in the places Seraphine had passed through. Not merely calmed, healed, some of them. In the village of Anwick, they found a farmer who described a young woman who had spent 2 nights in his barn, and, in exchange for the lodging, had laid her hands on his old working horse, who had been sick for a month. The horse had recovered completely by morning. The farmer said the woman had eyes like moonlight and had barely spoken, but she had smiled at the horse while she worked, and that smile, he said, was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. In the market town of Grayvane, a healer had hired Seraphine for 3 days' work, not knowing who she was, only knowing that she was gifted in a way that went beyond training. She had treated packless wolves, rogue wolves, humans from the border settlements who had no access to proper medical care. She had worked without a break, efficiently and without complaint, and she had left before the healer thought to ask her name. She wouldn't take any money, the healer told them, confused. I tried to pay her. She said she had enough. In a village called Mossfield, at the edge of the southern border where Ashvale's authority grew thin and patchy, they found a child, a small girl, maybe 5 years old, with the hollow eyes of a sick packmate who had been deteriorating for months. Her parents had no access to kingdom healers. They had been told there was nothing to be done. Seraphine had found her 2 days before Kalian arrived. She had spent an entire night with the child, and in the morning the girl was sitting up and asking for food. Kalian stood in that small, poor house and looked at the child, healthy and bright-eyed and completely unaware of the significance of what had been done for her, and felt something complicated and painful work its way through his chest. She hadn't left to hide, or rather, she had left to hide, yes, from the pain, from the humiliation, from the wreckage of something she'd never been given a name for, but she had not hidden from the world. She had simply redirected. She had taken everything she was and poured it outward, and into the places that needed it most, into the places that had no other resources, and she had done it alone and quietly and without anyone to thank her. He had thought of her all this time as someone who had been broken by what he'd done. She had not been broken. She had simply been free of him, and done something with that freedom. The realization was both humbling and devastating in equal measure. Marin tracked the silver thread further south, beyond Mossfield, and the trail moved toward the Coldfen borderlands, a liminal territory between Ashvale and the southern Free Packs, who answered to no king and who were known for 2 things: ferocious independence and exceptional hospitality toward those who arrived with skills and no demands. It was exactly, Aldrich observed quietly, where someone with Seraphine's gifts and Seraphine's particular brand of self-reliance would end up. They crossed the border on the 8th day. The Free Pack settlement of Veld Hollow occupied a natural hollow in the Coldfen Hills, a cluster of stone buildings arranged around a central fire square, surrounded by dense hawthorn and silver pine, entirely defensible and entirely unlike the formal architecture of Ashvale's noble territories. It was a community of roughly 300 souls, rogues, packless wolves, cross-border traders, and a handful of humans who had nowhere better to be. It was governed, if that was the right word, by a council of 7, headed by a massive, one-eyed she-wolf named Brecca, who had been running Veld Hollow for 11 years and had not once been given cause to question her own judgment, until a dark-haired woman with silver eyes had arrived at her gates 2.5 months ago, barefoot and in the snow, wearing a torn white gown under a borrowed coat, carrying nothing but a worn leather book and a compass and a small small bag of coin. Brecca had looked her over for a long moment. Can you fight?" she'd asked. "Not the way you probably mean," Seraphine had replied, "but I can heal. Packmates, rogues, humans, most injuries, some illness, and I can stabilize a wolf in crisis shift if you need it." Brecca had let her in. In the 10 weeks since, Veld Hollow had become quietly and significantly healthier, not just physically. The packmates who had chronic tension, the kind that built up in communities of wolves who didn't belong to a formal pack and had no alpha bond to anchor them, had less of it. Arguments that would have escalated dissolved sooner. The younger wolves who struggled with their shifts found, inexplicably, that they shifted more easily when Seraphine was near. None of them knew the technical term for what she was. They just knew that she was good to have around. That she worked hard and didn't complain and didn't ask for anything. That she sat with the sick and the dying with the same unhurried presence. And that she sometimes, very rarely, smiled. And that when she did, it was like watching something very fragile choose to be brave. Brecca had asked her once where she'd come from. "North," Seraphine had said. "You came in wearing a ceremonial gown." "I know." Brecca had looked at her for a long moment. "Someone's looking for you," she'd said. "Not a question." "They're not," Seraphine had replied, and there had been something in her voice when she said it, something that sat just underneath the certainty, small and raw, that had made Brecca decide not to push. She had been wrong, as it turned out. On the morning of the 8th day after Kalian left Thornhaven, she was in the healing room behind the longhouse when she heard the change in the community outside. A ripple of awareness, the subtle shift in energy that moved through a group of wolves when something significant entered their territory. She had learned to read those ripples in 10 weeks. She set down the poultice she was preparing and wiped her hands and walked to the window. 6 riders at the edge of the settlement square. No banners, but one of them, the one at the front, dismounting now with a particular quality of movement that her nervous system recognized before her conscious mind caught up, was someone she knew. She felt him before she saw his face clearly, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm arrives, a pulling sensation in her chest, low and persistent, that she had spent 2.5 months learning to ignore. It had gotten harder, not easier. She had thought distance would dilute it. Instead, it had become more acute, like the absence of something your body had always assumed would be present, an ache so constant she'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost. She stepped back from the window. Brecca appeared in the doorway a moment later, and her single eye was very bright. "There are 6 wolves from Ashvale in my square," she said. "One of them is the Alpha King." A pause. "And he's looking at the healing house." Seraphine's hands were steady. She was proud of that. Tell him I'm busy," she said. Brecca looked at her for a long moment. "Syrah." "I'm busy, Brecca." "He looks—" Brecca searched for the word. "He looks like a man who has been sleeping badly for 2 months and blames himself for it." "He should. That's fair." Brecca crossed her arms. "But he came a long way. On his own, mostly, without his court or his flags or his fancy armor. Just him and 5 wolves and a tracking lead that apparently ended at your window." She paused. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to. This is Veld Hollow, my law, my territory. He came correct. No weapons drawn, asked permission at the gate. I can send him away." Seraphine said nothing for a long moment. "But you won't?" Brecca said quietly, "because some part of you needs to hear what he has to say, even if the rest of you would rather not." Seraphine looked at the window. Beyond it she could feel him, that pressure in her chest, that impossible pull, and steady and unreasonable and present in her body like a second heartbeat. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She made him wait 20 minutes, which Kalian bore with absolute stillness in the center of Veld Hollow's fire square, watched by approximately 40 curious wolves, who made no attempt to pretend they were doing anything other than watching. When she finally walked out of the healing house, she looked different than he remembered, stronger, somehow. The translucence she'd always had, that quality of being slightly less present than the people around her, of occupying the edges of rooms rather than their centers, was gone. She stood with her full weight. She walked with the quiet authority of someone who had built something and knew its value. She stopped 10 feet from him. She didn't speak first. He had prepared words, weeks of words, on horseback through the gray winter landscape, sitting sleepless in roadside inns, on standing in small houses, hearing about the things she'd done in her wake. He had prepared exactly what he would say. He said none of it. What came out was Seraphine, just her name, and his voice saying it had a quality she had never heard from him before. She looked at him. Those silver eyes. Those eyes the old lore had been written about, that the archive records described in careful detail, that he now understood in a way that transformed him entirely, were steady and careful, and gave him nothing. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know. You have a queen. You have a bonding ceremony that the whole kingdom witnessed. You have—" "I know," he said again. "Then why?" "Because I found out what you are." The words came out flat and stripped of ceremony. What the silver thread means, what the Veilthir bond is, and what it requires. What I was given, and what I walked away from, because I was too arrogant to recognize it. He stopped, breathed, and because I have been unable to put a single coherent thought together since I read it. Because my pack bonds are fraying, because my kingdom is becoming unstable, because 3 of my warriors can't control their shifts. He paused again, and because none of that is why I'm standing in front of you right now. Then what is? Because I knew. His voice changed, dropped lower, a rougher, stripped of the careful flatness. Not from the archive, before the archive, I knew. Every time I sought you out, every time I told you things I told no one else, every time I stood in that training yard at midnight and looked for you before I even knew I was looking. He looked at her directly, without the careful deflection he had always used when speaking to her, without the socially sanctioned distance the court had provided as cover. I knew, and I told myself it wasn't what it was. And then I stood in that courtyard and chose someone else, and you were 20 feet away in the back of the crowd, and He stopped. The fire square was very quiet. "You were 20 feet away," he said, "and I didn't say your name." Seraphine's composure, that extraordinary, maintained, hard-won composure, flickered, just for a moment. A barely perceptible movement at the corner of her mouth. Something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, and was somehow both. "I know you didn't," she said very quietly. "I am sorry." The words were not ceremonial. They did not have the smooth formality of a political apology or the calculated vulnerability of a man trying to manipulate an outcome. They were simply true, said the way men who are not accustomed to saying such things say them when they have finally run out of alternatives, rough and unpolished and entirely genuine. She looked at him for a long moment. "Kalian," she said. His name, his actual name, without the title, the way she had always said it in the training yard and the quiet corridors, and the small hours of honesty they had built together over 7 years. "You came here to tell me what I am to your kingdom, what the bond means, what the archive says." She paused. "But I already know what I am. I have always known, not from any archive. Just from being what I am, and feeling what I feel, and understanding that the world has a particular way of being indifferent to it." "You knew?" He stared at her. "You knew about the bond?" "I knew what I felt." She met his eyes. "I didn't have the old language for it, but I didn't need it." A pause, barely audible. "It didn't matter what I knew, it only matters what you chose. I chose wrong. Flat. Absolute. Yes. Equally flat." "You did." The acknowledgement hung between them, not a relief, not a resolution, just a truth finally spoken in the open air where it had always belonged. "And Isolde?" she asked. Is the Alpha Queen of Ashvale in name? The bond is not— He paused carefully. It is not a true bond. It cannot be. Because— He stopped again. Because you already have one, she said. So quietly, it was almost not a sentence at all. He looked at her. Something in his wolf. Something older than thought. Older than the politics and the strategy and the terrible, careful pride that had brought them here, rose toward her with a recognition so absolute it was almost violent. Yes, he said. Seraphine looked away. She looked at the fire square, at the watching wolves of Veld Hollow, at the gray, winter sky above the hawthorn. She looked at the horizon, at the direction she had come from and was not sure she could return to. You broke something, she said, not accusatory, just clear. Not just between us. You broke the version of me that waited, that was patient, that believed. She stopped. I am not that person anymore. I have spent 8 weeks building something here, something mine, something I didn't have to earn by being invisible in someone else's court. Her voice, for the first time, carried the edge of the real thing, the hurt beneath the composure, the grief beneath the clarity. You come here and tell me I am important now, that the archive says so, that your pack needs me, that you, a breath. Do you understand how that sounds? Yes, he said, I do. Then you understand why I'm not ready to I'm not asking you to simply anything. His voice was very controlled. I'm not asking you to come back to Thornhaven and stand in that court and smile while Isolde sits where you should have sat. I am not asking you to forgive me or pretend the last 8 weeks didn't happen, or return to being invisible in the background of my life. A pause. I'm asking you to let me— He stopped, seemed to reach for something, some piece of language that hadn't been in any of the speeches he'd prepared. Let me be accountable. Let me tell you everything I know and everything I should have known and let you make a real choice. The choice you were never given. Brecca's voice came from behind Seraphine. The one-eyed she-wolf had positioned herself on the steps of the longhouse at some point during the conversation, arms crossed, watching with the focused attention of a general in the middle of someone else's battle. Alpha King, Brecca said, her voice carrying the particular weight of territorial authority. You're on my land. By my law, she is protected here for as long as she wants to be. Whatever she chooses, I will honor, but— She paused significantly. She is also free to make whatever choice she makes, including hearing you out. She looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked back. Something passed between them, the compressed language of two women who had spent 10 weeks understanding each other. One night, Seraphine said finally. To Kalian, you can stay one night, you can tell me everything, and in the morning— She met his eyes. I decide. They sat by the longhouse fire while Veld Hollow settled around them, the community returning to its evening patterns with the diplomatic nonchalance of wolves who were pretending very hard not to be listening. Kalian told her everything. The archive, the vial, their records, his father's annotations, Elder Cora's visit, the state of the pack bonds, the deteriorating stability that had begun the day after the ceremony and was moving, week by week, on toward a crisis point that the kingdom didn't have language for yet, but was beginning to feel in its bones. Seraphine listened the way she always had, entirely, without interrupting, with those silver eyes on the middle distance and her hands still in her lap. When he finished— She was quiet for a long time. So, the kingdom needs me, she said at last. Yes. He paused. But that is not the same as me needing you, and I need to be clear about the difference. She looked at him. I need you, he said, for reasons that have nothing to do with the archive, that are not strategic and not political, and not because Elder Cora told me what would happen if you weren't found. I need you because I am— He stopped, looked at the fire. Less. Without you I'm less than what I should be. Less than what I was when you were there. Not because of the bond. Because of you. Because of the person you are and the way you see things and the way you listened when no one else knew I needed to be heard and the way you told me the truth even when it was inconvenient for both of us." He looked back at her. "That is why I rode south, not the archive." The fire crackled. Seraphine turned something over in her hands. Her father's compass, the one she'd carried since Thornhaven. Old brass, slightly dented. She turned it, and its needle swung, and it pointed north. It always pointed north. "I loved you," she said, very quietly, very precisely, not past tense as punctuation, past tense as information. "For a long time. I don't know what I feel now. There is still something. There is still that pull." She touched her sternum. "Briefly. But the person who loved you quietly from the back of the room and asked for nothing and waited, she walked into the ashwood and didn't come back. I am not her anymore." "I know," he said. "I am not going to be invisible." Her voice was very level. "Not ever again. Not for you, not for your court, not for political necessity." "I know. Isolde, the council is already reviewing the bond's validity based on the Veilthir documentation. Elder Cora has a legal opinion that Not asking about the legal opinion." She met his eyes. "I'm asking you. What do you want to do about Isolde?" He held her gaze without flinching. "What is right? What I should have done before the ceremony, instead of making a political calculation and calling it wisdom." A pause. "I chose wrong. I will not compound that error with another." Seraphine was quiet for a long time. The fire burned down. The sounds of Veld Hollow settled into nighttime patterns, the low sounds of community, fire, and rest. Outside, the winter sky had cleared and the moon was rising, not full, but significant, pale and cold and enormous, washing the Coldfen Hills in silver. "Tell me about Veld Hollow," Kalian said at last. She blinked. "What? What you've built here, what you've been doing. Tell me." He settled back, not as an alpha king making requests, but as someone genuinely asking. The posture of the training yard at midnight, the posture of the quiet corridors. "I want to hear it." She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not a wall coming down exactly, but a door slightly opening. And she talked about Brekka. About the free packs and their particular kind of sovereignty, about the packless wolves who needed stabilization and the sick children and the healer in Greyvein who had been doing everything alone and shouldn't have to, about the things she had discovered about herself in the absence of Thornhaven's hierarchy, that she was more effective when she wasn't performing invisibility, when she simply moved through the world as herself. Kalian listened, without interrupting. Without offering solutions or assessments or the reflexive authority he brought to every conversation in his own court, he just listened, the way she had listened to him, for 7 years. At some point in the small hours, the conversation moved into something that wasn't about the kingdom or the bond or the archive. It moved into the smaller territory of two people who had known each other for a long time and had never quite allowed themselves to be known. He told her about his father, the real version, not the political myth. She told him about her own father, about the disgrace, about what it felt like to grow up carrying inherited shame in a court that never let you forget it. They didn't resolve anything. They didn't arrive at answers. But the conversation had a quality of genuine exchange that neither of them had permitted before, not even in the training yard at midnight, because before, there had always been the shape of what they weren't saying sitting in the room with them. Now, the unsaid things had finally been said. When dawn began to gray the eastern edge of the sky, they had been talking for 6 hours. Seraphine stood up and walked to the longhouse door, and stood there looking at the pale light growing over the hills. "I'm not coming back to Thornhaven," she said. "Not yet. Not until—" She paused. "Not until certain things are done. The Vein bond. The Veilthir documentation. The question of what I would be in that court if I returned." Not a servant, Kalian said immediately. No. She looked at him over her shoulder. Not a servant, not a political solution, not someone who is there because the archive says she has to be. A pause. I would need to know what I am going there to be. He stood up, crossed the room, stopped at a respectful distance, not touching, not crowding, but close enough that the pull between them was a physical thing, audible almost, like a sound at the very edge of hearing. You would be the one I should have chosen, he said, on that solstice night when I stood in the courtyard and was too much of a coward to understand what I already knew. He met her eyes. Everything else is a title we would negotiate. The silence was very long. The dawn was arriving, pale and cold and entirely new. Seraphine turned to face him fully. She looked at him with those silver eyes that had been written about in archives older than either of them, that had steadied warhounds and calmed broken wolves and watched a kingdom from the back of every room for 7 years. Give me a month, she said. Complete what needs to be completed in Ashvale, and come back here without your crown and without your warriors and ask me again. Just me? Just you? He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face rearranged itself, not submission, not defeat, but something that was, in its way, more significant. Surrender, the voluntary kind. 1 month. He agreed. He came back in 27 days, not with his crown, not with warriors or trackers or the formal regalia of the Alpha King. He came on horseback, alone, through the Cold Fen Hills in the gray light of early morning, and he arrived at Veldhollow's gate as the settlement was waking, and he asked, at the gate, properly, the way free wolves demanded, if he might be allowed inside. Brecca let him in herself. He found Seraphine in the healing room, which was where she always was in the early hours, preparing the day's work with the methodical focus that had always been the signature of her particular intelligence. She heard him coming, felt him coming, the pressure in her chest announcing his approach the way it always had, and she set down what she was working on and turned around. He looked different. 27 days of riding and difficult conversations and a political dissolution that had shaken Ashvale's noble families to their roots had done something to the smooth armor of his authority. He looked for the first time in their long and complicated acquaintance, genuinely uncertain. She noticed that she loved him for it. She hadn't expected that. She had spent the month preparing herself for something more complicated, for ambivalence, for guardedness, for the slow work of rebuilding trust in deliberate and structural ways. She was still prepared for that work. She would do that work. This was not a resolution. This was a beginning, and beginnings were hard. But she noticed, very clearly, standing in the healing room of Veldhollow with the morning light coming through the window, that she loved him. The new version of that feeling, not the quiet, patient, invisible love of the back-of-the-room version of herself, but something with edges and demands and full knowledge of its own value. "You came back," she said. "I said I would. People say things. I know." He stopped just inside the doorway. The uncertain expression held. The vain bond has been formally dissolved. Elder Cora completed the Vielther documentation and presented it to the full council 3 weeks ago. The noble houses, most of them, have accepted the legal opinion. A pause. Marin Vane is furious. He will be furious for some time. That is his right. And Isolde? He stopped, chose his words, more gracious about it than she was required to be. She knew, not from the archive, she knew the bond wasn't real. She had known since the ceremony. He met Seraphine's eyes. She also knew who you were. She had known for years. She was not as indifferent as she appeared. Seraphine absorbed this. "The pack bonds?" she asked. Stabilizing, slowly. Elder Cora says... He stopped himself. You said not to come here with political reports." "I did say that." He looked at her. "I am standing in the Cold Fen Hills 27 days after you sent me away and asked me to come back as myself. I have done what needed to be done. I have come without my crown and without my warriors. I have asked at your gate. He paused. I am asking you again. Come home, not to be anything the court needs you to be. Not to save the pack bonds or fulfill the veil their prophecy or stabilize alliances. His voice was very steady. Come home because I am better when you're there, and because I would spend the rest of my life making up the ground I lost if you let me. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. She turned the brass compass over in her hands. Old habit, the thing she reached for when she needed to think. Its needle swung north. It always swung north. She thought about Thornhaven, the dark stone and the great hall and the court with its careful hierarchies and its long memory. She thought about the person she had been there and the person she was now. She thought about the healing room she had built in Veld Hollow, and Brecca's single-eyed shrewdness, and the packless wolves she had stabilized, and the child in Mossfield who was alive and healthy because she had existed and been present and done the work. She thought about the choice she had never been given. She was being given it now. I am not leaving Veld Hollow behind, she said. What I've built here matters. The free packs need what I can offer them as much as Ashvale does. I know. He said, we can build something. A formal arrangement between Ashvale and the free packs. Resources, healers, representation. Something that didn't exist before. He paused. Something you would design. You would give the free packs formal recognition. I would give you whatever you needed to say yes. She looked at him for a long time. The compass needle pointed north. She set it down on the work table. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. Real ones. Written. Council endorsed. Done. I will not be invisible. Not in that court, not in that kingdom, not ever again. Whatever I am to Ashvale, I am that fully and visibly. Or not at all. Agreed. And if you ever make a decision about my life without asking me first, her eyes were very clear and very direct. I will leave again, and next time I will go further south. I know, he said, and you would be right to. He met her eyes with the particular steadiness of someone who has finally, at significant cost, arrived at a truth they intend to keep. I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to make decisions beside you. Not for you. Not instead of you. Beside. The healing room was very quiet. Outside, Veld Hollow was waking fully, the sounds of morning fires and voices and the small, alive noise of a community moving into its day. Seraphine looked at the man in the doorway, this man who had made the worst decision of his life and then ridden south alone to own it. This man who was, underneath the crown and the armor and the carefully maintained authority, the same person who had stood in the training yard at midnight, unable to name what he was looking for, and found her there anyway. She had not stopped loving him. She was not going to pretend otherwise. All right, she said very quietly. He crossed the room in 3 steps, and she let him, and when he reached her, he stopped, still not touching, holding the space she needed, and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that she had read like weather for 7 years. All right, he asked. All right. She held his gaze, but Kalian, she said his name the way she always had, without the title, in the voice of the training yard, of the quiet hours. Do not make me regret this. He lifted his hand very slowly, and she let him press it flat against her sternum, where the silver thread hummed its constant, impossible note, the bond that had been written in the archive that had waited 7 years. That had survived the worst thing he could have done to it and come out the other side still legible. Never again, he said. She covered his hand with hers. Outside, the sun broke through the winter clouds, and the hills of the Cold Fen were briefly, brilliantly, silver. And somewhere in the north, in the kingdom that bore the weight of its king's mistakes and the slow healing work of reckoning, the pack bonds steadied, just slightly, just enough. A thread pulling taut. A needle. I'm finding north. The story of Seraphine Vale and Kylian Draven, of what was built in the wreckage of what was broken, continues.